all, I appreciate the compelling concerns and various viewpoints raised today regarding masking and what's in the best interest of our children, students, open education, physical, emotional, and mental well-being. I also believe that in-person instruction is best for students when I'm committed to working with our superintendent, our district, our parents, and the governmental authorities in keeping our schools open. I also fully support the CDC recommendation that strongly encourages everyone to wear a mask. However, the CDC and the PDE, have made the recommendation short of being a mandate. And at this time, based on our mitigation efforts as provided by Dr. French and the analysis, I do not feel at this point to change the policy as we have in place currently. However, I am committed to making sure that we do what it takes to keep our schools open.
I work a fair amount with domestic violence situations, and I've had victims come to me sometimes and say, my partner will never hit my child. I'll leave when they hit my child, which is permission to hit their child once. Likewise, in a painful analogy, if we have a position where we say that if we have to close a school, we're going to go to a mandate, we've given permission for the situation to arise that we have to close the school. And I think that is irresponsible. If it would be the right course of action to mask mandate after a school closure, we are risking our children in creating a situation where a closure is possible. So I would make a motion that we have mandatory masking throughout the district beginning with the beginning of the school year. If at the end of the semester the circumstances have changed.
You're up for election this voting.
Stop it.
No, please.
If after a semester the circumstances have changed and under 12s can get vaccinated or the Delta variant has petered out, we are free to reevaluate. But
we were doing this for 2 weeks and we are still at the same point.
You do not have the floor, ma'am.
This is a public meeting, thank you.
Please, if I may.
We pay taxes.
Please. Our children are watching this. As adults, we've all had time and we've listened to one another's input. Please be respectful of other people's discussions and opinions. Thank you.
So I would make a motion that a mask mandate be implemented at the beginning of school, subject to reevaluation in changing circumstances.
Second. Moved and seconded. The floor is open for board discussion.
So, I started school today with 80 students. My 80 students were the same students last year that before there was a governor mandate, we went to masks. We stayed in school all year long, wearing masks. That's great. You can tell me all the information about the microns and all the negative tone for it. My responsibility is to keep these schools open and keep the kids safe. It's not acceptable to hear only 300 kids died. I don't want to hear any kids died, okay? That's my responsibility to try to protect everybody. If you want to sue. You know what? It only goes against your tax dollars. We'll come up with all these threats.
He gets sued personally.
Right now, Clary, Allegheny Valley, Keystone Oaks, Montour, West Mifflin, Wilkinsburg, Woodland Hills, Mount Lebanon, City, Pittsburgh, South Fayette.
What made you change your mind? What made you change your mind from June 28th?
I'm not going to answer to you, but I can tell everybody else the reason I changed my mind is the climate right now. They just moved 4 counties into the hazard zone.
That's not our county.
Our kids aren't wearing
That's
masks,
not our
period.
county.
It is.
So what's the repercussions?
There are 27 counties. 27.
Excuse me, you all had your time to talk. You'll have an opportunity to talk after this. After the board is done talking, before any vote is taken, there's an opportunity for public comment, and you'll be offered that opportunity. But please let the board members state their opinion so you at least know what's going on.
So last year I had 15 students that ended up getting COVID. Out of those 15 students, nobody got transmission from in class because they had to wear masks all the time. Now, we didn't have any problems because the students are a little bit older and we didn't have to deal with parents. So they were all obliged by law and wearing their masks and kept safe. So I think that being the case, we should alter our plan.
I have a question. Dr. French, I don't know if you or Mr. Fisher, but the changes that the health department just put out, what levels do they start closing the schools?
The guidance related to the school closures was just released today, and I'm still tearing through it, but on the first read of it, they did not give closure guidelines like they did last year, where they were very cut and dry specific. Now with their online reporting, we're mandated to report cases, and we submit a line list, which would be the number of close contacts that would have to be excluded. They will analyze that data and they will reach out to us with recommendations. Their general rule of thumb is that they will intervene when we have what they call outbreaks. And they describe that as 2 or more children who have been infected within the school setting that cannot be attributed to outside. If we have multiple of those clusters, so it could be within in a group, like for example a classroom or within a sports team. So really, they're not giving us the cut to dry charts that we had last year. They will analyze the information and act to mitigate in school outbreaks. And so their approach is they want to maintain in-person learning as long as they can. That if they did not contain an outbreak, it potentially could spread through an entire building. And then children have to be quarantined unnecessarily. So again, I can't give you a direct that they would do. If 10 kids, it's this. It will be on a consultation basis. They will then make the determination to intervene.
Dr. French, in that guidance, did they anywhere indicate over what time frame those infections would have occurred?
Yeah. So what they're looking at now, because the data has evolved, and what they're looking at, they're seeing that what they consider to be outbreaks occur within a 14-day window, because that it should have run the initial exposure should have run its course in those 14 days, so they would know what additional infections were related to that initial exposure that happened within the school. So it's over a 14-day period. They're also did put a line in the sand saying that they likely would not recommend closures for longer than 14 days. So they would allow that up, that they would close the school, then within effect, that you kind of the virus would run its course for at least that initial outbreak.
But if I can add to that also, they did say when there is a school closure, did they not, that all sports and extracurricular activities will also have to be closed during that time that the school is closed?
Yes, they did say that, because it doesn't make much sense that you still allow this external contacts of potentially infected individuals. So that would be an additional closure.
And that's my biggest concern is I agree with the psychiatrist who talked about the fact that the biggest thing is keeping schools open and less kids being excluded from school, which would mean their isolation and their inability to participate in in-person learning. And I'm leaning towards everyone 12 and above is able to get vaccinated, and if you are vaccinated, am I correct in that if you are a close contact with somebody, you will not be excluded from school? You'll still be able to attend in-person instruction, but just have to wear a mask during the period of 14 days or until you test negative. So that protects students from not being excluded from school and be able to participate fully and not be isolated. The problem that I have is with the kids that are younger than 12 who cannot get vaccinated. And I've had this discussion with you, Dr. French, about how are we going to deal with the fact that you cannot get 6 feet of distance in between. So if a student comes in masked and sits beside a student who is unmasked and becomes positive, they will have to be excluded from school as a close contact. However, if both students were masked, they can even be 3 feet apart, and then they would not be excluded if there was a case.
I think we need like a flow chart for something,
It's
so we
very
have any idea what's going
Peer-reviewed
on.
studies, no peer-reviewed studies on that.
Zero.
These are things that, the question that she's asking is about things that are not within our control. These are mandated quarantine and isolation. And
I can't follow this.
How are you going to track this distance between these students?
So I think just for clarity, what I had spoken about in the very beginning, we do not have control over the PA Department of Health's isolation and quarantine regulations. And under their current regulations, which they changed from last year, that now with the ability for some children to become vaccinated, they have removed vaccination as they've allowed it to be an exclusion. So in the past, last year, and everybody knows this, we have a lot of exclusions from school, that if there's an infected person who is within 6 feet of another person for more than 15 minutes, then the person who's infected is isolating for 10 days. The person who was a close contact has to quarantine. And trust me, we were up night and day doing these line lists to comply with these orders. It was a monster job to keep our schools open. They have allowed now 2 caveats. Again, the excluded, if you're a vaccinated individual, you will not be excluded unless you test positive. Then you move into isolation. You'll never be quarantined. If you wear a mask, and then the other person who is the infected person wears a mask, then the infected person who wears the mask will be isolated because they're positive, but the person who wore a mask, who would have been before a close contact, does not have to isolate, does not have to quarantine. That's under their new rules, so they can stay in school. But again, if anybody has an issue with that, please call the PA Department of Health. We have no control over those.
Government controls everything.
Yeah, there are criminal, our attorney has reviewed that with you earlier. There again, we do not have the authority to say we're not going to do it. We could certainly make a decision to run every stoplight, and every stop sign, but eventually I'm going to get caught. And I think this is very similar, that we have to, in our positions, at least comply with those quarantine and isolation rules.
Is there a negative test result criteria at the end of that as well? So if you test negative, you are now exempt?
I would like to say that I also have concerns about school closure and the effect of our students trying to receive their education while they're in quarantine at home. I also had another question for Dr. French, and that is, if a parent does choose to send their child to school with a mask, who's responsible for enforcing that? Can it be enforced?
For enforcing what?
Wearing the mask.
Okay.
So, say an elementary student, the family has chosen for that student to wear a mask to school. Who's responsible for enforcing that?
So, I think the completely honest answer to that is that we will do our best to do it. It's very interesting. Every time a child gets in trouble and I ask a parent, their child would never lie or never not do what they're supposed to do. But when it comes to this, I've had a lot of requests for assistance. If I tell my child to wear a mask, are you going to enforce that? I think we would do our best. But again, I will never promise that we will be 100%.
So from an operational standpoint, is it more difficult to have students that are choosing to wear a mask than those that are opting not to?
I'm sorry.
From an operational standpoint and classroom management and so forth, is it more difficult for a teacher to have two sets of students in their class, those that are masked and those that are unmasked?
Okay, for a teacher, I think obviously if everybody's masked and then they're not trying to figure out did Johnny's mom ask if they're gonna wear a mask or not. So I think if everybody is masked, then clearly that's not something that's on the teacher's plate.
Ms. Nelson, speaking as a practicing teacher, yes, anytime you have different conditions that apply to different students, yeah, clearly, it's gonna be harder. Unfortunately, that just goes with the nature of the job.
But what I was getting at earlier is there is a way for kids 12 and above to protect themselves from being excluded from school, and that's getting a choice to get a vaccine. But there is no, the choice to be excluded from school, even if you wear a mask, is dependent on how close you are to the unmasked student who's in your room. You don't have the same ability to protect you because you could wear a mask but still be excluded from school because you can't get 6 feet of distance, which is what you have to be for those kids. So what would you do? Would you put the unmasked kids on one side and the masked kids on the other? And how
I believe they call that segregation.
would do that?
So operationally, that would be one way that would work. That you would try to group all the children who are wearing masks and all the children who are not wearing masks in terms of a strict mitigation effort to reduce the likelihood of the number of close contacts. I certainly don't think that we would ever wanted to strategically assign children to maximize the quarantines.
The Democrats would.
So
Dr. French, what would happen in that situation then, if you can explain with what we got from the Department of Health and Services this afternoon? What would happen if you had a classroom that was mixed, that you were trying to separate some unmasked children and the masked children? What would happen in an exposure situation there?
So again, we go back to what we had to do all of last year, which is the contact tracing using the regulations that the PA Department of Health gives us, the criteria. In that case, we would identify the exposed individual. Look, who were they around 6 feet, who was around up to 6 feet for more than 15 minutes in every one of their classes. And we would identify, if all the children who were in that area, and then pull out, for example, the children who were exempt from being quarantined. So if a child was vaccinated, who was within that 6 feet, they would not have to be excluded from school. If the child who was exposed did not had a mask on, and the other children had masks on, they would not have to be excluded. But if the child who was within 6 feet who did not have a mask on would have to be excluded. If the infected child did not have a mask on, everybody within 6 feet who was not vaccinated would have to be excluded.
And that's my biggest concern, is for exclusion and talking about isolating kids, affecting parents who have to stay home then with their excluded child from work, and the fact that they're not guaranteed and probably won't have synchronous remote instruction. So I lean against masking everyone, but mandating masks for those students up to below 12 years of age. Until
We want to I see why you're not a lawyer anymore. So you're for child abuse.
the ones who aren't at risk.
Any other board comments?
Can ski at Seven Springs, but not at the Wisp.
Everyone who votes for this will be
Oh,
Everyone will be held accountable who votes.
Grow up! What's the matter with you?
I fought for this country, sir. Grow up. And my freedom is being taken away. I'm a member of this country, and I fought for it. You're not telling my kids to mask.
Please, sir, please.
Is that necessary?
Please, there are children who will be watching this. Please.
I believe you're making it necessary, sir.
Please.
No, I'm trying to keep a little order. We told you you could all talk later. You're acting very disrespectful. Let the board talk on what they said. Then you can talk and say what you want again. At least offer the board the courtesy that we're trying to offer you.
Well, you didn't offer us the courtesy of going over 5 minutes for those of us that wanted to, so.
And if we kept on going, and it would have gone a long time, we tried to be reasonable and offer everybody the same amount and be consistent.
That's what you got elected to do, is to go on as long as we need to.
Any other board comment on which one's up with this?
Mrs. Anderson, I see where you struggle and of like mind. Mask worked last year to keep our schools open. And I think operationally, I think we should continue at some level to ensure that kids stay in the schools for in-class, in-person instruction. I am struggling with whether to do universal masking for K through 12 versus masking for 12 and under. I've heard, arguments of rumbling. Don't turn your backs on the kids that are above 12 versus, only protecting the kids that are under 12. So I'm struggling with that decision.
Any other board comments?
I would like to make a motion to amend Mrs. Bowen's motion to modify the health plan so that masks would be mandated for only those under 12.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. Floor is open for discussion on that motion.
I understand the concept of your amendment, but I would actually like the board to vote on my motion first. And so I would oppose your amendment.
How would that actually work? If you did a cutoff like that, because you have intermingling, right, of ages and grades and.
What would that mean for the middle school?
So for the middle, in particular, it would impact the 6th grade, and certainly anything's doable. So if there was the cutoff there, what we would do is again just apply the cutoff. We know the children's birthdays, and anybody who that would apply to would have a mask, and anybody who didn't apply to in that particular grade would not have a mask on. So that we would have one grade level where some children are masked and some children are not. The issue there is that once they are eligible for the vaccine, then we have less of the issue with exclusions in that particular grade level.
Dr. French, if we were to go ahead and implement wearing the mask to everybody, at what point or what trigger point could we pull that back? In other words, right now, there's 4 counties, us included, that have hit the high area. At what point, if we implement it, could we pull that back and feel safe to do so?
So, it's just flat out answer to that is that the board at any point could pull that back in. I do know that in some cases, some other districts are making it contingent upon the community levels of transmission. When the community isn't high or substantial, that they have those increased mitigation risks or mitigation efforts. Whenever you move into low or moderate, then the mitigation kind of moves away and you monitor to see. So, but then you could potentially use community level transmission.
And we are at high and substantial right now, correct?
We just this week moved into, based on last week's numbers, we did move into the highest level in Washington County this week. And so this was it was 118 cases per 100,000.
So there are 4 levels. There are low, moderate, substantial, and high.
So if we went that way, it necessarily wouldn't be all year long. This could be relatively a short duration while we're in the high.
That's what they said last year.
I believe Ms. Bowman's initial recommendation was only for the first semester. Has that changed based on Ms. Anderson's recommendation or modification, whatever the proper term is?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking anybody, I don't know.
Mrs. Berman, did you make that distinction over the first semester?
Yes, I said that we would evaluate at the end of the first semester. That was my vision.
Any other board comment this time?
Mrs. Bowman, is the thought on that is that by the end of the first semester, the vaccine would probably be available for kids under 12?
Ask me the beginning again?
I said, was the thought process that you would only have universal masking for the first semester? Was the thought process was that by the end of the first semester, we should know whether the vaccine would be available for kids under 12?
Well, that would be a factor. The recommendation of a booster would be a factor. The current county conditions would be a factor. Any development of another variant would be, I mean, all of those things would come into play. Just as they do right now and just as they did last year. I mean, all of the environmental factors that we influence people safely would be part of an evaluation that we would take place. And I don't particularly have any investment in a semester, it's just a logical break point to gather information. And I have no problem, we've always had the freedom to call a special meeting and adjust things that needed to be adjusted. So there's no magic in a semester, and there's nothing that would prevent us from looking at it earlier. I just proposed a semester in my motion because it's at least blocked us into one point of evaluation.
I guess when I raised the question, I was mainly asking for Mrs. Anderson if her modification also was going to be limited to that semester or not.
I personally would think that once 12 and under or under 12 are able to get vaccinated, that's when I think it would be lifted. Because quite personally, everybody starts talking about it's my personal decision, but we see based on the rules for exclusion from school that an unmasked student in those that can not be vaccinated will affect the student sitting next to them, even if they chose to wear a mask. So to me, that's where I believe that a parent has the right to determine whether their child is vaccinated or not. And that would come once it's approved for kids of that age. But at this point in time, because kids under 12, and that's why I think that above 12, everybody and their parent has the choice to vaccinate their children and allow them a less chance of being excluded from school. But that same ability to prevent your child from being excluded from school when they become close contact does not exist in those that are under 12 because of the ability of the close contact. So,
Child 13.
But are you looking at a timeline for this of only the first semester or a year, or does it not matter?
I think it would be even less than a semester if for some reason, I talked about before with different people making it dependent on the levels of transmission, which is fine with me, but we have so many meetings, we can be very reactionary when that happens, because I mean, we've seen it, we talk and look every day every week they update the COVID, dashboard. So there could be a 4-week,
But you could do that with choice as well.
I don't know.
You could start out with choice, and then if it gets bad, move.
Any other board comments? There has been a legal issue raised, and at this point, I'd like to call a short executive session to clarify. Roger.
Does a negative test clear the child to go back in the classroom? It does. 1 test or 2?
How about 4?
1 test, 1 negative test or 2?
I think they're gonna call them back up.
1.